Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Frances Crook, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this In Conversation I'm going to have with Anna Hemmings, who is sitting in her office. Lucky her. I'm in my house in North London. Where's your office, Anna?
In Farringdon.
So Farringdon, oh, not too far
away. Yeah.
So we're going to have a conversation about gambling and crime, because Anna Hemmings is the head of GamCare. And the first thing I'm going to ask her to do is talk a little bit about herself, to explain how she came to where she is and her background. And then I'm going to ask her to say something about GamCare so that people understand what that is as well. So Anna, tell me about your background and how you came to GamCare.
Yeah, so I've worked in health and social care for, I suppose, all my life, really. My degree was in social policy, and then I did a master's later in addictive behaviour. So I've worked in addictions for probably the last 20 years, but I suppose in working in that, you get good, lots of exposure, obviously, to the criminal justice system and its workings, but also to related issues like mental health, domestic abuse. I've done lots of work around families. So I guess that led me here, really, and this role that I'm in here at GamCare was the first role that I've taken on with behavioural addiction. So previously it was drugs or alcohol. So it's been really, really interesting from that perspective. And little could I have known, really, when I took it on, that gambling has, in the 3 years I've been here, has just shot up the agenda in terms of media interest, political interest, public interest. So it was quite sort of timely in that way, really.
Yeah, interesting. I want to talk to you about drugs and alcohol and gambling and different addictions later. But
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about GamCare, because you've been there for 3 years now, and you've just, before we were talking about how much it's grown under your leadership massively. So tell me a bit about the organisation.
Yeah, so GamCare has been running since 1997. We were founded by someone called Paul Bellringer, who we're still in touch with, actually, which is lovely. And we operate the National Gambling Helpline, which is free to call 24 hours a day. And we deliver treatment in various locations around the country, both directly and via a network of partners as well that we work closely with. And then we also do lots of work around outreach and engagement, because gambling is just not really on the map as an issue, if you like, in this country. And we need people talking about it more and being more aware of some of the risks linked to it. So that's at the heart of our work, is reducing gambling-related harms. And everything we do really is to pursue that mission or vision. And yeah, we have grown over the last 3 years hugely. As I said, I think in some ways it's been a timely 3 years where gambling has gone up the agenda, and that's been helpful in making more funds available to us. So we've been really fortunate to be able to extend our reach and do more of what we do across both our work and that of our partner network. And we are seeing more people as a result. But yet, actually, in terms of the overall number of people at risk of gambling harms, very few come forward for treatment or support. And that's something we really need to kind of get underneath and address in our work.
Yes. Where does your money come from? Or follow the money.
So most of our funding actually is via Gamble Aware, who are a grant-making organisation working around research, education and treatment for gambling harms. So that's the bulk of it. We also get grants from elsewhere, donations from the public. But I suppose the contentious bit about working in this sector is that ultimately most funding does come in one way or another from the gambling industry in a sort of informal voluntary levy system. And that can feel contentious to some people, but I think the reality is that at the moment there's not really alternatives for us. There's not statutory funding available. So we are very clear about operating independently and managing any conflict of interest that arises from that. But I think at the moment, from a pragmatic perspective, it's the main source of funds available.
Yeah, I mean, I think the principle that the polluter pays is one I don't have a problem with, as long as the money is suitably and appropriately dealt with or laundered, you could say. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
And I think if it's done with integrity, which of course is where the money comes from and where it goes, and integrity is a hot political issue at the moment, rather, isn't it? But we won't go there. I think Rob has just put up in the chat box that GamCare won the Howard League Award last year's Organisation of the Year, and particularly for your work in raising awareness amongst professionals about gambling harms. So how do you tell me something more about the work that you've actually carried out to get that award, to get our.
Yeah, so thank you for the award. That's the first thing to say. We were so chuffed to win it. It really was. We were delighted with that. The work that we were doing actually focused on testing out a whole system approach to gambling in the criminal justice system in Hertfordshire. And we had some funding there from the Police and Crime Commissioner to work across all the sort of touchstones, so across police, probation, prisons, courts, and a bit of victim support as well, to raise awareness of gambling harms, to deliver training to professionals, to encourage the use of a single question screening tool. So just get people asking about gambling, whether that's related to crime. And that whole project was really partly successful in reaching people. So we trained over 500 staff and we increased the referrals through to treatment and worked across the whole system. And it gave us an opportunity to think more about how a whole system approach could work, and also to map the types of crime that are linked to gambling. And that in itself is really interesting, because with drugs and alcohol, which as we've said is my background, we're talking more about acquisitive crime. So, crime to get money to spend on drugs, for example. Whereas with gambling, it's a bit more diverse. There is some of that. There is acquisitive crime and debt, which is a big thing for some gamblers. But there's also more emotionally driven crimes like domestic abuse, which sadly we are seeing more of now on our helpline, and things like antisocial behaviour as well. And the thing that we've observed about the types of crime that are connected to gambling is that it can escalate quite quickly. And in fact, people's gambling generally can escalate quite quickly. So it was just a great project, really, to be able to get underneath and understand some of these issues, but also improve awareness and engagement with gambling in across Hertfordshire for criminal justice work as well.
It's funny, it's often the sort of shire counties where there's really revolutionary ideas and work going on. I had some contact with Hertfordshire Police some years ago, and they were doing some extraordinary things with burglars. Which was really interesting. Now, I want to pick up on this because the Howard League has set up a commission on crime and problem gambling, and we've been linking in or trying to link in with various different criminal justice agencies, and we found exactly what I think you've indicated, that there's that professionals are not aware of links between crime and gambling. And they haven't really thought about it. It's just not on their radar much. They know about drugs, they know about alcohol, they know about domestic violence, domestic abuse, but gambling is not on the radar. And I just wonder whether you've got some positively useful findings of how we could work better, or generally what professionals should do, or if you found some good practice amongst professionals. We haven't.
Well, I mean, there is some great work going on, but I think it's in pockets rather than being systematic. So gambling was recognised in the probation procurement exercise that's gone on recently, and we've been lucky to have some involvement in that and be working with other voluntary sector organisations to, we will be delivering some of that. So that's a step forward, that gambling was at least recognised as part of that process. And we've also had good engagement with some police forces around the country. So, for example, with the Met Police, we're training their custody staff at the moment, and police staff have been trained in about 10 other areas as well. So there's definitely some pockets of good stuff out there. The Hertfordshire pilot was great, and there's some great work that goes on in prisons, actually. So group work and other interventions delivered to gamblers in prisons and in military prisons as well. So it is happening, but because it's in pockets, it's easy for that to get lost, and pulling it all together into one place is really important, as is research. I must say, we don't have good research around the issue of crime and gambling, and that we can touch on that a bit more later. But I think the most important thing in terms of what professionals can be doing is, or two things really, at an individual level, is asking the question and building in that awareness of gambling. Because if you don't ask, you probably never know that gambling might be an issue for somebody. And the other thing is that we need a whole system approach. So there are some pragmatic things we could be looking at in terms of out of court disposals and other sort of practical ways of dealing with gambling and crime as well.
Yes, and we've been trying to engage with senior people at the Ministry of Justice, but they keep sort of throwing their hands up saying, we're thinking about it. So we will wait to hear what the thinking is.
Yeah, and of course it's been a tough year, hasn't it, with the pandemic? That's been difficult to manage, and in some respects it's made it more difficult to get things like this on the agenda.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think your work in Hertfordshire does give some very useful lessons for how we can look at whole system approaches. It's some local projects are useful local and you can't replicate them, but actually I think there's some good principles there. And you did look at where it's best to intervene with people who'd committed offences and what was the best intervention. And I'd be very interested in hearing what lessons there are from your work in Hertfordshire on that.
I think the main thing is this idea of a screening question. I mean, in terms of, there's the identification piece, and then there's the help and support and the treatment piece from our perspective. So in terms of identification, it's about asking the question, and it's one thing training people, but actually embedding it in people's practice is quite another challenge altogether. So that's something that's an ongoing piece of work. But initially actually having some physical presence of someone with gambling specialism in the various touchstones across the system is important as a way of getting it on the agenda. So asking the question so that we do identify where gambling is an issue is one big thing, and that's important across all of the touchstones, and it's important to ask it repeatedly because people will disclose at the point that feels comfortable to them, I guess. And then there's the getting that person seamlessly to the support that they need. And, that'll vary from person to person, but by and large, it'll be one-to-one sort of counselling style support. And also putting tools in place, so making sure that you've got self-exclusion and blocking software and limiting your access to gambling products as well. So it's those two key areas, really, that I think are the biggest things for us.
Very, very useful lessons, and I think our work in the Commission at Howard League has found something similar, that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on at policing level. But did you have any joy with judges and magistrates?
Less so. I mean, we have had some contact and some involvement, and I think like a lot of, I was going to say newer issues. I suppose gambling's not that new really, but it's new in this sort of setting. And you do get some sort of trailblazers that have a particular interest for whatever reason. So we've had some contact and some contact with the Magistrates Association as well. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of achieving any sort of systematic change, that's been more challenging where that's concerned. A bit similar to what you were saying before about the MOJ, actually. It's similar there. We've had some contact and some interest, but it's hard to really get that whole system moving. It's a big beast.
Yes, I mean that we've just done some research with magistrates in partnership with the Magistrates Association, asking about their experience and their thoughts, which will be published in a month or so. And there really isn't a lot of thinking. There's some goodwill and interest, which is a start. That's the first step, but we need to. Then a lot more work needs to be done with sentences.
And there's some good experience actually from drugs and alcohol and other issues to draw on. So there's some really good models out there that really have been quite successful. And I remember when I worked in substance misuse, there was quite a mixed feeling, I suppose, when the mandatory treatment orders came in, the drug treatment orders. And I suppose some skepticism among the treatment staff about whether treatment could be effective if it was mandated, because there's a question there about motivation. And I think ultimately the evidence was that it was as effective as any other treatment. And that's so there's some quite interesting findings from far more developed systems that might also be relevant for gambling. Yes. And I think we should really use the evidence from those systems.
Yeah, I must admit, when the drug testing treatment order was brought in, I was very sceptical. But actually, I sat in with a judge who was sentencing people and getting people to come back because the thing about that order is that there was a relationship with the judge, so that you had the same judge, and you felt the people came back and reported, and it was almost parental in that sense. Obviously, it was. And surveillance and all sorts of other things and punitive, but there was an element of care there too, which is lacking in the rest of the justice system. Actually, that's what I wanted to come on to next. Was there are big differences between the different kinds of addictions,
Yeah, there are.
alcohol and gambling, but and there are differences in the kinds of crime and the timing of the crimes that people commit.
Yeah.
With different sorts of addictions, and because you've got experience across the whole piece, I wonder if you've got any explanation or thoughts or ideas on why that would be, and how we have to respond to the differences, particularly with gambling.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question actually, because gambling is more different, if you like, from other addictions than I thought it would be. I suppose when I came here, I probably thought there'd be more similarities than really there are, and I don't know if we've got enough research to sort of confirm. I can just tell you from my personal experience what I've observed. And I guess what I've found here is that gamblers come to treatment with more sort of personal capital, if you like, than drug users or drinkers might, in the sense that they've quite often got a home and quite often got a job and quite often got some form of family support, which was often lacking actually in people with other addictions. So they come into treatment with some of the things that will really stand them in good stead in recovery. And they also seem to do really well in treatment in fewer sessions. So the average number of treatment sessions that people have is 6 here, whereas in substance misuse services, that would be very few. So lots of people in substance misuse are there for years in treatment. So there are some key differences that's quite interesting. The type of crime is definitely different, as you've said, and it's just slightly different drivers for the crime. Like I say, that quite often some of the crime is emotionally driven. There's the domestic abuse and antisocial behaviour, which are as important as the acquisitive crime side of things. And sometimes actually the offending with gambling is just part of a wider criminal lifestyle as well. So there definitely are differences. I can't remember your actual question now. I'm sorry.
About the differences. You were answering it. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing that struck me, I don't know whether this is true or not, and you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong here, is that the thing about if you're an alcoholic, if you're addicted to drugs, there's a limit to how much alcohol you can drink. Yeah. Whereas there is no limit to gambling. It can just go on and on and on. Even in one session, you can go on. You don't need to stop. And I think that's what makes it. There's something really terrifying about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of our the users of our services talk about money running out or getting to a real crisis point. But you're right, the availability is there 24/7 now with online gambling, and so there aren't very many hard stops for people, and that's really, really difficult. And what we see is that people come forward in crisis a lot of the time. They leave it really late to seek help because they become very isolated. They gamble on their own often. They've spent all their money. They don't know how to tell their family. And I suppose a bit like mental health issues, there's a lot. It can feel really hard to come forward. People feel a lot of stigma and shame about addictions, and I guess that one of the differences is that gambling really is potentially invisible to people around you. You can see if someone's drunk, and you can usually see if someone's high. But with gambling, you can't see it. And I've heard families talk about thinking someone was having an affair or had another family, or when actually they were just isolated with a device and gambling. So it's a really tricky one to spot. That's why we're so keen to promote conversations in families and communities about gambling, because we need to make people feel more comfortable to talk about it and ask for help earlier, because they do come forward at the moment, late in the day. And ultimately, the earlier people come forward, the more you can avoid the connection to crime, you can avoid harms, you can avoid the financial and relationship impacts that people experience.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, actually, something's just come up in the chat, which was going to be my next question, which was about the difference in the crimes that are linked to problem gambling between men and women. I wonder if you've identified any patterns of differences between the kinds of crimes or the kind of gambling that men and women are engaged in?
Well, it's a really interesting question. So men and women do present a little bit differently. So women, more men than women contact us. So something like 70-80% of the callers to the National Gambling Helpline would be men. Of the women calling, about half are gamblers and the other half are affected others. And that's one thing to note with women. They're often affected by somebody else's gambling in terms of trying to sort of keep family finances together or support the individual, but sometimes experiencing domestic abuse as well. You know, there's some really tough stuff that goes on for families. But where women do gamble, it tends to be online more than offline. You can imagine betting shops might not feel so comfortable of an environment for women. And in terms of crimes, I'm not sure that we've got enough evidence to really understand how women's criminality differs from men's in terms of gambling, but similar kinds of stuff in terms of acquisitive crime to pay off debts and so on. And you know, potentially some emotionally driven crime, but with domestic abuse, I think we hear from more women that are victims and perpetrators of that, as you'd expect, I guess. So yeah, so women present differently. They find it harder to come forward for help. They feel, I think women often perceive gambling as a male issue and experience additional layers of stigma in coming forward. That's how I would describe it. And that can sometimes mean that they can also come forward late and are experiencing quite severe harms by the time they do.
Yes, when when we were setting up the Commission on Crime and Problem Gambling, I started collecting stories from the newspapers, and one particularly sad was a woman who'd been stealing the little scratch cards. She was a night cleaner, and she'd been stealing the scratch cards, and she got caught, and she ended up in prison because you're thieving from your employer, and that's it's a very serious thing to do. And I just thought it was really, really sad. I mean, it wasn't a big thing. It didn't involve a lot of money, but it was just a breach of trust. She ended up with a prison sentence.
It's really tough what families go through, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to go on to something else. Ask about the companies, the gambling companies. Do you have much contact with the gambling companies, and do you take a view on some of their policies, like the promotion of gambling through advertising and sponsorship, or do you stay well clear of those issues?
So it's a really interesting question, partly because there's a Gambling Act review going on at the moment. So the government are reviewing the old 2005 legislation. We do have some contact. There is an arm of our work that faces gambling businesses, if you like, and we do offer them training on customer interaction to try and ensure that they're able to get people to the help they need quickly and efficiently, and we'll offer a warm transfer service so they can transfer their callers into our helpline, so there's no sort of attrition there, which is important. And we've worked with them recently on how they display safer gambling information, so to make that more consistent across gambling businesses, which hopefully will make it easier for people to find help when they need it. And then we also have a sort of audit and certification product that looks at the culture of different operators around safer gambling, and looks at innovation really around consumer protection. So we do have some contact with them, and there's the Gambling Act review going on.
Have you submitted to that? Have you done it?
Yeah, we've submitted. Is
that published?
Yeah, it's published, so you can have a look at that on our website.
On the website. Everyone look at the website.
Yeah, I mean, our biggest issue within that is the need for more investment in research, education and treatment around this issue, because our funding is very limited. I mean, we touched on the fact we've grown earlier, but actually, so few gamblers come forward, and there's so little investment compared to other health and social care issues that we really need to bring more money into the system, to make treatment more visible, more available, to raise the profile of gambling harms, to raise awareness in exactly the ways we've been talking about. Here we're talking about criminal justice, but actually across all of our local areas, all our communities, and all of health and social care provision as well, we need to be raising gambling up the agenda. So for us, that's sort of the biggest thing really in our response, is that need for proper structured investment to get the system working as effectively as it can. We've achieved great things with limited resources, but we need more really.
That was a good plug. Well done.
Yeah. But the Gambling Act review is casting the net quite wide and is looking at things like online protections, advertising, regulation, and so on. So it's got the potential to be quite a sort of root and branch review of the legislation that was passed in 2005, the world's changed a lot since then, hasn't it, with our online lives, and especially in the last year, I guess, as well. So it's about updating it so it's suitable now for the digital age.
Yes, I mean, we're certainly finding evidence that the crimes linked to problem gambling is a hidden area, and often I think quite deliberately we want to do some work with employers, because I know that there's a lot of employer theft that is not dealt with, not reported, but is dealt with, by employers quietly because of reputational issues. So I think that the tip of the iceberg tends to be fraud and domestic abuse, domestic violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that what you're finding on your helpline as well? That those are the issues that come up, or are there other things?
In respect of crime, those are the issues that come up. Yeah. So theft from I mean, I suppose you've got an escalation of financial issues that ultimately sometimes finishes with theft from employers or elsewhere, or fraud, those sorts of crimes. But actually before that, you're starting to spend more than you can afford, and then you're starting to go without things, and then you're starting to not pay your bills, and then you're starting to borrow from family, and it sort of works its way up, and people sort of work through the funds they've got available, and crime can be the end result of that. So we see all of that sort of spectrum, I guess, on the helpline, as well as the whole spectrum of mental health impacts that people are feeling, and that they're many, and the relationship impacts as well. But in terms of crime, those are the big areas. Yeah, so acquisitive crime, or fraud, or theft from employers, and then domestic abuse, either people who are perpetrating or victims of. It can be either or both. And as I say, on that particular score, we're seeing more of that in the pandemic, which is worrying for us, and difficult, in fact, for our helpline. Yes,
I mean, we did some sessions on our commission with people who've lived experience of gambling and crime, but also the evidence of the devastating impact on families was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, on women, and because of mostly men who gave evidence, not sometimes but men. Do you work with children? Do you have any work with children?
Well, our education programme works with young people, so I suppose sort of secondary school age generally, and upwards, and we do have support available for young people, whether it's their own gambling or that of a loved one that they're concerned about. So there is some support out there. But similarly, actually, gambling doesn't have the profile on the PSHE agenda that other risky behaviours do. So I think schools are used to talking more about, smoking, drinking, drugs, sex education, more than gambling. It is on the PSHE curriculum now. It was added quite recently. So we do quite a lot of work with young people in schools and out of school as well, on NCS schemes and youth clubs and so on, or in sport, to try and just raise awareness, have the conversations, and encourage their critical thinking skills around gambling, making sure that they understand that, what a random number generator is, or that it's not a way to make money, those sorts of things. And so a lot of our work with young people focuses on education, but we feel it's really important to have that support backstop as well, because in doing the education, sometimes you come across young people who are affected and are worried about their parents gambling, for example. So it's important that there's support available for them as well. The other group I'd say is young adults. So people who have turned 18, so gambling's become a legal activity for them. But they may not know that much about it, and students, for example, get a big influx of income if they apply for a student loan, and it's not uncommon on the helpline. We'll hear from people who've just blown that, and now I've got nothing to live on, and a sort of getting into gambling quite quickly. So that's a really important age, that 18 to 25 bracket of they're not children or young people, but younger adults.
But they're not really grown up either. As we know, brain development, we know that young adults haven't fully developed in
that's true, yeah,
maturity.
Yeah, and their assessment of risk, their risk appetite, impulsivity, that is all still developing. So we certainly advocate greater protections for that age group. I think that's a really important thing. So yeah, we work across that spectrum, and actually, I think around 60% of callers to their helpline are under the age of 35. So it's a relatively young cohort, and their gambling will often have started at a fairly young age.
Yes, yeah. And I wonder also the slippery slope between gaming and gambling, because gaming, I mean, I know nothing about this, having never actually played a video game of any kind. I mean, I think I did the one where in the pubs where they used to go eat down, and that was it. I haven't done it since. So that's a long time ago. But I'm told that, the gaming involves purchasing things which lead you into, which in themselves are principally gambling as well.
Yeah, there's a few things in that space. So there's loot boxes, which are, I suppose, a bit like an online version of a lucky dip, where you sort of pay for, you pay for the loot box, and something that's useful to help you complete the game might be in it, or it might contain nothing. So it is a form of gambling, really.
Yes.
And has been banned.
But that's quite young children do that, don't they? So that's
yeah, it's in some games and not others, but it's definitely something for parents to be aware of, because you can end up with quite quickly accumulating spend. So it's a gambling-like behaviour, definitely, in games, and there are other gambling-like behaviours that come up in games. Then there's esports, which is another fast-developing area, which is of interest. And then there's kind of other peripheral things like cryptocurrencies and some of that kind of thing that young people talk about and are involved with. That's not gambling necessarily, but it's on the periphery, and they're sort of issues of concern. But there is definitely this grey area between gambling-like behaviours in games that I suppose the concern's about normalisation. That's similar with advertising. The concern is that you normalise gambling activities at a very young age, and that's something we probably need to be a bit wary of.
Yes, interesting. One of the things that how the Commission did recently was there was a big international congress on crime, and we've always presented there. We have the League has consultative status with the UN, so we've always been active at that level, and we held a seminar on gambling and crime at the UN Congress. And we just found that there was very little awareness internationally. And we found the same thing in our literature search, which we published as well earlier this year. And there's a lot of work on all sorts of things to do with international drugs and all of that sort of thing. But gambling is just not on the international horizon at all. And yet it clearly is a growing problem internationally. I wonder, do you have links internationally? Does your organisation have links with other organisations working in other countries?
Yeah, we do actually. We've got links with organisations in Australia and Canada, a little bit in America, done bits in, I suppose, more unusual places like Cyprus or the Maldives even. But there are particular countries internationally that have got more developed gambling environments, and I suppose Australia and Canada are the closest. Although in terms of gambling, the British, the UK gambling market, I suppose, is one of the best developed in the world, I think. I think it is. Yeah, it is.
But one of the most regulated as well, is it, or not?
Yeah, it is. It is. But there is enormous variety actually internationally, partly in what type of gambling is legal or not in different countries, what the accessibility and availability of it is, and how it's regulated as well. There is a lot of international variation on that, and that's really interesting for us to explore. So, for example, in America, sports betting is just starting, really. They didn't have sports betting until quite recently. whereas they have got a very, very developed casino culture in some states. So it's just sort of different types of gambling, different cultures around gambling in different jurisdictions internationally.
But quite a lot of the gambling companies in this country are offshore. So I would have expected they would have been more predatory in other countries than to allow for, that was an opportunity for them if they're not based here. They can be more international. I don't think it's something we should be proud of, that we're leading the way in different forms of gambling.
Well, I don't know if I'd say leading the way, but we're one of the most developed markets for gambling and one of the most regulated. So, and that is evolving all the time. Obviously, we've got this review now, so our regulation may change further. I don't know, but it's it's interesting, the international comparisons, and it's a lot to keep up with actually. But there are various international events where we can share sort of evidence, and that's an important thing, because there's not a lot of research in this field. Sharing evidence internationally about what works is really helpful sometimes in moving the debate forward. So there are lots of really positive things about that international community.
Yeah. I think my definition of hell would be Las Vegas. I can't imagine anything more horrific. I want to talk about talking about links with other organisations. I know you have good links with other voluntary organisations. I mean, one thing about the voluntary sector is we're all good to each other. We do talk to each other. We do spend a lot of energy and effort liaising with each other. And I know you work with organisations like Beacon Counselling Trust, which is involved in the Howard League's commission as well. But there seem to be, and maybe I'm wrong on this, I don't know, but there seem to be many more organisations working on drug abuse, for example, or alcohol. So I just wondered what recommendations you would have for the landscape and the voluntary sector in the future. Obviously more money, and that's, I understand that. But what kind of developments would you like to see in the voluntary sector and as a contribution to gambling, preventing gambling harm, but also on the crime issue too?
I probably think the biggest thing going forward is about raising this up the agenda and having the conversations, and whether that is informal or formal. It sort of needs to be both, really. You need the screening questions built into people's assessments, or the way they explore issues with people who use their services. So across the criminal justice system, for example, we do need to be asking about gambling at different touchstones within there. But actually also we just need to have the conversation more generally. I sometimes liken this field to how, say, 10 years ago in mental health, nobody felt so comfortable to talk about that. And a big job of work has been done, and there's been real significant moves forward in the last 10 years to get us more comfortable with asking for help and talking about depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues as and when they come up, and being much more open about that. And that's where we need to get to with gambling. So partly we need to build it in formally to all of the systems and processes that we use in health and social care and in criminal justice settings. But also we just need to promote the issue, the conversation in a much wider sense, so that people feel comfortable to say and come forward for help sooner. And get quick access to the help they need. I think those are the biggest things. And alongside that, we do need more research. There's been a real dearth of research studies, particularly around gambling and crime. So that that's an area that would benefit hugely from some focus going forward to help us evidence what's needed and evidence these links that I've talked about from more of a, I suppose, from our experience of them. Yes. But if we could have the formal research that backed that up, I think it would really help move things forward.
And we've certainly found that when we did the literature search, that there was surprisingly little research around. A very small group of academics working on it. It was not on the radar of a lot of academics who were thinking about future research, or even people who are funding research. And I agree with you about the idea that we need more conversation about it. And I like your analogy with mental health and how it was 10 years ago. So I think what we need is more soaps dealing with it. We need more royals dealing with it, talking about gambling as a problem, as a challenge. I mean, obviously I'm an Archers fan, and there was a storyline with the vet was an addicted gambler, but he didn't commit crimes. It was borderline. I don't think it was crime related. So I think we need a soap story, which is gambling linked to crime, and that would deal with the issues and get it out there, then more.
Yeah.
But where are you going next? What's the plans for GamCare for the future?
So, well, it's a very timely moment to ask that, actually, because we're launching our new 3-year strategy in the next couple of weeks, and it won't surprise you to hear that in its wider sense, that strategy focuses on really putting gambling harms on the map, raising awareness of them, better access to tools and support, better access to treatment. But from a criminal justice perspective particularly, we're delighted that we've received some more funding to develop our work around criminal justice further with our partners who, as you know, work extensively themselves too with criminal justice organisations, whether it's police, prisons, probation and so on. So that just means that we'll be able to pull together, I talked about the sort of pockets of great work that's happening earlier, so pull together and share knowledge and information about that, build a better evidence base, pilot some new approaches. So we're really excited for the next couple of years to come to be developing this. So yeah, and we'll be, within that, we want to work closely with people with lived experience, which we have done in terms of things like co-designing some of our resources that we've produced for the criminal justice system, but that's another area that we're really looking to build on going forward.
Yes, that sounds fascinating, and I'm sure we'll be involved with that. My last question is, do you have any specific ideas for the Howard Lees Commission on crime and problem gambling? Is there anything you think we should be doing? And we've got plans for talking to people. We're going to be publishing, we're going to be commissioning more research, but it's small scale research. It's not big cohort studies. But what should, any ideas that what we should be doing?
Well, I mean, I think the real win would be to engage some like the MOJ. Yeah. HMPPS and so on, and get that kind of at scale interest in the issue. That's probably what would lead to a step change in the way things are done. But I appreciate that there's many competing priorities at the moment, and that's not an easy task. But I think for all of us, we've got opportunities to kind of if we pull what we know and pull together all of that evidence, I think there is actually a strong and compelling argument for more work to be done, and for that work to be done in a systematic way. And I think it's about all of us kind of collaborating in order to build the evidence base and push that argument forwards, because together we will definitely be sort of greater than the sum of the parts. And I think that we're gathering momentum at the moment. So just for us continuing to work together will be one of the biggest things going forward.
Anna, that's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much for giving us the time and for having this conversation. I've learned a lot, and we've kept the audience. So thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us. This was recorded, so it will go on our YouTube channel and things like that. Finally, everybody who's listening to this, please support GamCare, join the Howard League. Those are the two things that I want you to take away from this, definitely. And thank you very much. I'm going to really look forward to working with you again in the future, and look forward to developing the work from Hertfordshire, because I was very excited by that. Thank you very much, Anna. It's been fascinating. I'm very grateful to you for your time. Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.